The summer of 1984 began with Sarah Collins stepping out of her father's station wagon onto the sun-baked streets of Millbrook, Indiana. At 18, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that came from spending too much time with books and not enough time believing in herself. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon light as she surveyed the small town that would become her temporary home. Robert Collins, her father, stood beside the car adjusting his tie despite the oppressive heat. His eyes held the weight of a man trying to hold his family together while his wife recovered from what the doctors euphemistically called nervous exhaustion. Sarah understood the arrangement. She would help her Aunt Helen with the flower shop while her mother healed from a broken heart that had manifested as something more clinical. The main street of Millbrook stretched before them like a scene from a Norman Rockwell painting. Classic cars lined the curb, their chrome bumpers reflecting the Indiana sun. Teenagers gathered outside Murphy's Five and Dime, sharing bottles of Coca-Cola and secrets. The distant sound of pop music drifted from transistor radios, mixing with the lazy hum of summer insects. After her father's awkward departure, Sarah found herself standing alone on the sidewalk, her single suitcase at her feet, feeling like an extra in someone else's movie. The town seemed to pulse with a rhythm she didn't yet understand, filled with inside jokes and shared histories that stretched back generations. Helen Morrison's flower shop sat wedged between the hardware store and a small diner, its windows filled with arrangements that seemed to capture the essence of summer itself. When Sarah pushed through the door, the scent of roses and baby's breath enveloped her like a gentle embrace. Helen, her mother's younger sister, emerged from behind the counter with arms outstretched. At 45, she had the kind of easy smile that suggested she'd found peace with her choices. She'd never married, never had children, but had instead poured her maternal instincts into her garden and her shop. The reunion between aunt and niece carried the weight of unspoken understanding. Helen had been there when Sarah's mother first began retreating into herself, when the bills and the responsibilities and the general disappointment of adult life had proven too much to bear. She'd seen how Sarah had tried to hold everything together, becoming an adult before she'd finished being a child. As Sarah settled into the small apartment above the flower shop, she began to understand that this summer would be different from any she'd known. Millbrook operated on its own clock, where afternoons stretched like taffy and evenings were measured in porch conversations and firefly observations. 3 days into her residency in Millbrook, Sarah discovered chapter and verse books. The small bookstore sat on a corner lot, its faded sign creaking in the summer breeze. The owner, Mr. Peterson, was a retired English teacher who'd turned his love of literature into a modest business that barely broke even but kept him surrounded by the words that had shaped his life. The store's interior felt like a sanctuary, with tall shelves packed tight with books and comfortable reading chairs positioned near the windows. Sarah had been browsing the poetry section when she became aware of being watched. She turned to find a young man about her age studying her. With undisguised curiosity, Michael Reynolds possessed the kind of dark good looks that came with an edge of danger. His hair fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd given up on conventional grooming, and his clothes carried the careful dishevelment of someone who'd learned to make poverty look like a fashion choice. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They held an intensity that suggested he'd seen more of the world than most 19-year-olds. Their first conversation revealed a shared love of literature, particularly the kind of books that dealt with characters who felt displaced in their own lives. Michael had been reading Salinger, and Sarah found herself defending Holden Caulfield's famous angst against the criticism of those who dismissed it as mere teenage whining. In that moment, surrounded by books and afternoon sunlight, something shifted between them. Sarah felt recognized in a way she'd never experienced before. Michael saw past her carefully constructed politeness to the intelligence and passion she kept hidden beneath her small-town propriety. Michael revealed himself to be the town's unofficial rebel, the son of a factory worker who'd died in an industrial accident 2 years earlier. He lived with his mother in a small house on the wrong side of town and worked part-time at the local garage to help pay bills. His intelligence had earned him a scholarship to Indiana University, but he'd deferred enrollment to help his family through their financial crisis. As they talked, Sarah learned that Michael spent his free time writing, poetry mostly, but also short stories that he kept private. He'd grown up feeling like an outsider in Millbrook, too smart for the factory work that claimed most of his classmates, but too poor to pursue the alternatives his intelligence suggested. For Sarah, meeting Michael felt like discovering a secret room in a house she'd lived in all her life. Here was someone who understood the weight of responsibility that came with being the stable one in an unstable family. He recognized her loneliness without judgment and her intelligence without intimidation. Their conversation was interrupted by Mr. Peterson, who reminded Michael about a book order that needed to be picked up. As Michael prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah with an expression that seemed to weigh the risks of extending himself. That he asked if she might like to explore more of Millbrook with him, and Sarah found herself saying yes, before she'd fully considered the implications. Something about Michael made her feel brave in a way she'd never experienced before. The relationship between Sarah and Michael began in the careful way of two people who'd learned not to trust too quickly. They started with afternoon meetings at the bookstore, discussing the novels they'd read and the dreams they'd harbored. Their conversations revealed a shared sense of being caught between worlds, too sophisticated for their small-town surroundings, but too rooted in family obligation to simply leave. Michael introduced Sarah to his Millbrook, the version of town that existed beyond the sanitized main street. He showed her the abandoned railroad tracks where he went to think, the old quarry where teenagers went to swim and make mistakes they'd remember forever. He walked her through the neighborhoods where the factory workers lived, pointing out the gardens where people grew their own vegetables and the porches where 3 generations might gather on summer evenings. Through Michael's eyes, Sarah began to see Millbrook not as a place of limitation but as a community with its own complex rhythms and unexpected beauties. She learned that the woman who ran the diner had put 2 sons through college on tips and determination, that the old man who sat on the courthouse steps every day was a Korean War veteran who'd never talked about what he'd seen. Their friendship deepened through shared experiences that felt significant precisely because they were so simple. They spent afternoons at the quarry, where Michael would read his poetry aloud while Sarah listened with the intensity of someone discovering a new language. They explored the countryside in Michael's beat-up Chevrolet, driving the back roads while debating the merits of different authors and sharing their fears about the future. Sarah found herself looking forward to these meetings with an intensity that surprised her. She'd wake up thinking about things she wanted to tell Michael, observations about life in Millbrook or responses to books he'd recommended. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had a true intellectual equal, someone who challenged her thinking while respecting her opinions. Michael, for his part, seemed to blossom under Sarah's attention. She brought out a gentleness in him that contrasted with his public persona as the town's brooding rebel. With her, he could admit his uncertainties about the future, his fears about leaving his mother, his dreams of becoming a writer in a world that seemed to have little use for the kind of stories he wanted to tell. As June melted into July, their relationship took on the quality of a secret shared between them. They developed their own private language, references that only they understood. Michael would leave books for Sarah at Helen's flower shop, carefully chosen volumes that he felt would speak to her particular interests. Sarah began carrying a small notebook, writing down observations about their conversations and the way Michael made her see the world differently. The other teenagers in Millbrook watched their developing friendship with the mixture of curiosity and judgment that small towns specialize in. Some wondered what Sarah Collins, the nice girl from the flower shop, was doing with Michael Reynolds, the boy who'd been in trouble with the law for underage drinking and who'd been known to mouth off to teachers. Others recognized the inevitable attraction between 2 intelligent people who'd found each other in a place where intelligence was often viewed with suspicion, but Sarah and Michael remained largely oblivious to the opinions of others. They existed in a bubble of their own making, where literature and philosophy and dreams of the future seemed more real than the practical concerns that governed most people's lives. They were falling in love, though neither had yet found the courage to name what was happening between them. By the middle of July, Sarah and Michael had established a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Most mornings, Sarah would work in Helen's flower shop, learning the subtle art of arrangement and discovering that she had an unexpected talent for combining colors and textures in ways that pleased the eye. Helen watched her niece with knowing eyes, recognizing the signs of a young woman coming into her own. The afternoons belonged to Michael. He would appear at the shop around 2 o'clock, when the heat made flower arranging uncomfortable, and Helen was happy to let Sarah escape for a few hours. They would walk through the town, sometimes stopping at the bookstore, sometimes driving out to the quarry or the abandoned railroad bridge that Michael had claimed as his private thinking spot. It was during one of these afternoon excursions that Sarah first saw Michael's poetry notebook. They'd been sitting by the quarry, watching the local kids brave enough to jump from the rocky outcropping into the surprisingly deep water below. Michael had been writing while Sarah read, and when a sudden gust of wind threatened to blow his pages into the water, Sarah instinctively reached out to help him secure them. The glimpse she caught of his handwriting, careful, deliberate, with words crossed out and rewritten, made her realize that Michael took his writing seriously in a way that went beyond teenage angst. His poetry dealt with themes of loss and longing, but also with hope and the possibility of transformation. The few lines she managed to read suggested a depth of feeling that matched her own hidden emotional life. When Michael realized she'd seen his work, he didn't withdraw in embarrassment as she might have expected. Instead, he asked if she'd like to hear what he'd been writing. His voice carried a vulnerability that she'd never heard before, as if he were offering her access to his most private thoughts. The poem he read was about summer afternoons and the way they seemed to exist outside of normal time. It captured the feeling of being suspended between childhood and adulthood, between the safety of the familiar and the terror of the unknown. But more than that, it captured something specific about their relationship, the way they'd found in each other a refuge from the expectations and limitations that surrounded them. Sarah listened with tears in her eyes, not from sadness but from the recognition that someone had finally put into words feelings she'd never been able to articulate. When Michael finished reading, she found herself reaching for his hand, a gesture that felt both inevitable and revolutionary. That evening, back in her room above the flower shop, Sarah began to write. At first, she told herself she was simply recording her thoughts about the day, but as the words flowed onto the page, she realized she was writing to Michael. The letter began as an attempt to respond to his poetry but evolved into something more personal, a confession of how he'd changed her understanding of herself and what she wanted from life. She wrote about how his friendship had made her feel intelligent and interesting for the first time in her life. She wrote about the way he listened to her opinions without condescension and challenged her thinking without making her feel diminished. Most importantly, she wrote about the growing certainty that she was falling in love with him, though she couldn't bring herself to use those exact words. When she finished the letter, Sarah folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her small desk. She told herself she would never send it, that it was simply an exercise in self-expression. But the act of writing it had clarified something important. What she felt for Michael went beyond friendship or even infatuation. It was the kind of love that changes the shape of your future, that makes you willing to risk everything for the possibility of being truly known by another person. Over the following days, Sarah found herself writing more letters. Each one explored different aspects of her feelings for Michael, different moments in their developing relationship that had taken on special significance. She wrote about the way he laughed at her jokes, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about books, the way he seemed to understand her thoughts before she'd fully formed them herself. The letters became a private ritual, a way of processing the intensity of what she was experiencing. She convinced herself that writing them was enough, that the act of putting her feelings into words was sufficient without the risk of actually sharing them. But with each letter, the temptation to tell Michael how she felt grew stronger. Meanwhile, Michael seemed to be wrestling with his own feelings. Sarah noticed that he watched her more intently than before, as if he were trying to read something in her face. Their conversations took on a new charged quality, filled with meaningful pauses and looks that lasted a moment too long. The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility, but neither had yet found the courage to reach across the space that separated them. The summer was building towards something, a moment of truth that would determine the shape of their future. Sarah felt it in the way Michael's voice changed when he said her name, in the way her heart raced when she saw him walking toward the flower shop. They were balanced on the edge of something that would either bring them together or tear them apart, and the uncertainty was both thrilling and terrifying. The last week of July brought with it a heat wave that seemed to press down on Millbrook like a heavy blanket. The flowers in Helen's shop wilted despite her best efforts, and even the evening air offered little relief from the oppressive humidity. It was during one of these sweltering afternoons that Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She had been writing letters to Michael for 2 weeks, each one more revealing than the last. The drawer of her desk now held a small stack of folded papers, each one containing pieces of her heart that she'd been too afraid to share in person. The weight of her unexpressed feelings had become unbearable, like carrying a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. Michael had been different lately, too. Their conversations had taken on an edge of desperation, as if both of them sensed that something was coming to an end. He'd been accepted to Indiana University after all, a late admission that had surprised everyone, including himself. The deferment he'd taken to help his family had been noted by the admissions office, and they'd offered him a place in the fall semester along with an enhanced financial aid package. The news should have been cause for celebration, but instead it cast a shadow over their remaining time together. Sarah found herself counting the days until August would give way to September, when Michael would leave for Bloomington and their summer would officially end. It was on a particularly humid Thursday afternoon that Sarah finally found the courage to act. She had written what she knew would be her final letter to Michael, one that contained everything she'd been too afraid to say. In it, she told him about the way he'd changed her understanding of herself, about the dreams she'd begun to have for their future, about the love that had grown between them like something wild and ungovernable. But instead of adding this letter to the collection in her drawer, Sarah folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope. She wrote Michael's name on the outside in her careful handwriting, then sealed it with a determination that surprised her. The walk to Michael's house felt like the longest journey of her life. She'd been there before, but always with him, never alone. His mother, Mrs. Reynolds, was a quiet woman who worked double shifts at the hospital and seemed perpetually exhausted. The house itself was small but tidy, with a garden that Mrs. Reynolds tended with the same careful attention she gave to her patients. Sarah knocked on the door with trembling hands, but there was no answer. She could hear voices from the backyard and followed the sound to find Michael working on his car with his neighbor, Tom Brady, a boy their age who'd already committed to following his father into the factory. Michael looked up from the engine he'd been tinkering with, his face streaked with grease and sweat. When he saw Sarah, his expression shifted from concentration to surprise, then to something that might have been joy. Tom excused himself with the intuition of someone who recognized a private moment in the making. Sarah stood in the backyard, the letter burning in her pocket, trying to find the words to explain why she'd come. Instead of speaking, she handed him the envelope. Michael looked at it with an expression of confusion mixed with something that might have been hope. He wiped his hands on a rag before taking it, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for something precious. Michael read the letter while Sarah stood watching, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She watched his face change as he processed her words, saw the moment when understanding dawned in his eyes. When he finished reading, Michael looked at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without a word, he crossed the space between them and kissed her. The kiss was everything Sarah had imagined and nothing like she'd expected. It was tentative at first, as if Michael were asking a question, then deeper as she responded with an answer that came from someplace deeper than thought. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, looking at each other with the wonder of people who'd just discovered they could fly. Michael told her he'd been writing letters too, letters he'd been too afraid to send. He'd been carrying one in his pocket for days, waiting for the right moment to give it to her. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and handed it to her with shaking hands. His letter was shorter than hers, but no less revealing. In it, he wrote about the way she'd changed his understanding of what was possible in his life. He wrote about the fear that had kept him from speaking his feelings, the certainty that someone like her could never truly care for someone like him. But most importantly, he wrote about the love that had grown between them, a love that felt too big for the small world of Millbrook. Standing in his backyard, surrounded by the ordinary details of small-town life, Sarah and Michael finally acknowledged what had been building between them all summer. They were in love, completely and utterly, with the kind of intensity that only comes once in a lifetime. The admission of their love changed everything and nothing. Sarah and Michael still met in the afternoons, still walked the familiar paths through Millbrook, still shared their thoughts about books and dreams and the future. But now their time together was charged with a new intimacy, a sense of having crossed a threshold from which there was no return. They became masters of stolen moments, finding ways to be alone together despite the watchful eyes of a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. They would drive to the quarry and sit talking until the sun set, sharing kisses that felt like promises and touches that spoke of deeper longings. They would meet at the old railroad bridge, where Michael would read his poetry while Sarah listened. With the attention of someone trying to memorize, every word that Sarah's letter writing took on a new urgency. Now that she knew her feelings were reciprocated, she found herself documenting every moment of their relationship, every conversation that revealed new depths to their connection. She wrote about the way Michael looked when he was thinking. The way his laugh sounded when he was truly happy, the way he seemed to understand her thoughts before she'd fully formed them. The letters became a way of preserving their summer, of creating a record of a love that felt too precious to trust. To memory alone. She wrote about their first kiss, about the afternoon they spent lying in the grass talking about their dreams, about the evening they slow danced to a song playing on his car radio while fireflies blinked around them like tiny stars. But even as Sarah documented their happiness, she was acutely aware of its temporary nature. August was approaching with the inevitability of a season change, and with it would come Michael's departure for college. They talked about the future in careful, optimistic terms, making plans for visits and phone calls and letters that would keep them connected across the distance. Michael spoke of transferring to a school closer to home after his first year, of finding a way to build a life that could include both his education and his love for Sarah. Sarah talked about applying to colleges herself, about the possibility of joining him in Bloomington or finding a school nearby. Their plans had the fervent quality of people trying to convince themselves that love could conquer the practical realities of life. The other residents of Millbrook watched their romance with the mixture of affection and concern that small towns reserve for young love. Helen observed her niece's transformation with knowing eyes, recognizing the signs of a woman discovering her own power. She'd seen Sarah bloom over the summer, watched her grow from a frightened girl into someone who knew her own worth. Mrs. Reynolds, Michael's mother, was more cautious in her approval. She'd seen too many young men derailed by early romance, too many bright futures dimmed by the weight of premature commitment. But she couldn't deny the change in her son, the way he'd grown more thoughtful and purposeful since meeting Sarah. The town's teenagers watched the relationship with the fascination of people observing something rare and beautiful. Sarah and Michael had become the standard against which other romances were measured, proof that real love could exist even in a place as ordinary as Millbrook. But beneath the surface of their happiness, both Sarah and Michael were aware of the approaching crisis. They were living in a bubble of summer bliss that would inevitably burst when September arrived. The knowledge that their time together was limited gave their relationship an intensity that was both exhilarating and heartbreaking. As the days of August began to count down, their conversations took on an edge of desperation. They talked about everything and nothing, trying to say all the things that needed to be said before their opportunity was lost. They made promises and plans and declarations of eternal love, all the while knowing that the world had a way of interfering with the best-laid plans of 18-year-olds. Sarah's letters from this period reflect the bittersweet nature of their situation. She wrote about the joy of being loved and the fear of losing that love. She wrote about the way Michael made her feel beautiful and intelligent and worthy of good things. But she also wrote about the growing certainty that their summer couldn't last forever, that real life was waiting to intrude on their perfect world. The letters became more frequent as August progressed, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single day. Sarah poured her heart onto paper with an urgency that suggested she was trying to capture something that was slipping away. She wrote about conversations, about kisses, about the way Michael's eyes looked in the afternoon light. She wrote about her fears and her hopes and her absolute certainty that what they had was real and worth fighting for. The crisis that would ultimately separate Sarah and Michael came not from any failure of love between them, but from the harsh realities of life that have a way of intruding on even the most perfect summers. It began with a phone call on a humid Tuesday morning in mid-August, when Sarah was arranging flowers and thinking about the afternoon she would spend with Michael. Helen answered the phone with her usual cheerful greeting, but Sarah could tell from the change in her aunt's voice that something was wrong. The conversation was brief and tense, filled with the kind of careful language that adults use when they're trying to prevent panic. When Helen hung up, she turned to Sarah with an expression of carefully controlled concern. Sarah's mother had taken a turn for the worse, the doctors were recommending additional treatment, and Sarah's father needed her to come home immediately. The summer that had felt like it would last forever was suddenly over. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known that her stay in Millbrook was temporary, but she had allowed herself to believe that somehow things would work out, that she would find a way to stay or that Michael would find a way to come with her. The reality of having to leave within days, of having to abandon the life she'd built in Millbrook, felt like a kind of death. Helen tried to comfort her niece, reminding her that family came first and that sometimes life required sacrifices that felt impossible to make. But Sarah could see the sadness in her aunt's eyes, the recognition that this particular ending was especially cruel in its timing. The conversation with Michael was even more difficult. Sarah found him at the bookstore, browsing through a collection of poetry that he'd been considering for his college courses. When she told him about the phone call, about her need to leave Millbrook within the week, she watched his face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of resigned devastation. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking through town, trying to process the sudden change in their circumstances. Michael talked about dropping out of college, about finding a job so he could follow Sarah back to her hometown. Sarah talked about refusing to leave, about staying in Millbrook and getting a job to support herself, but even as they made these desperate plans, both of them knew that they were 18 years old with no resources and families who needed them. The romantic notion of choosing love over responsibility was appealing in theory but impractical in reality. The remaining days of Sarah's stay passed in a blur of painful conversations and desperate attempts to create memories that would last. They drove to all their special places, trying to say goodbye to the locations that had become sacred to them. They talked about the future with the kind of forced optimism that people use when they're trying to convince themselves that everything will work out. Sarah's letter writing became frantic during these final days. She wrote about the unfairness of having to leave just when she'd found happiness, about the fear that distance would erode what they'd built together. She wrote about the way Michael held her when she cried, about the promises they made to each other in the darkness of his car, but she also wrote about the love that had changed her, about the way Michael had helped her understand her own worth and potential. She wrote about the certainty that what they'd shared was real and valuable, regardless of what happened in the future. The night before Sarah was scheduled to leave, she and Michael met at the railroad bridge for what they both knew would be their final time together. The summer air was thick with the promise of autumn, and the sound of crickets provided a soundtrack to their goodbye. They talked about everything and nothing, trying to memorize each other's voices and faces. Michael gave Sarah a book of poetry that he'd inscribed with a message about love transcending distance and time. Sarah gave Michael a photograph of herself that she'd had taken at the drugstore, writing on the back that she would love him forever. When it came time to part, neither of them wanted to be the first to leave. They stood holding each other in the darkness, both crying and both trying to be strong for the other. Finally, Michael walked Sarah back to the flower shop, kissing her goodbye on the doorstep like a scene from a movie. The next morning, Sarah's father arrived early to collect her and her belongings. The goodbye with Helen was tearful but necessarily brief. As they drove away from Millbrook, Sarah turned to watch the town disappear behind them, feeling like she was leaving a part of herself behind. She carried with her a suitcase full of clothes and a heart full of memories. Hidden in the bottom of her bag was a small wooden box that contained all the letters she'd written to Michael over the summer, the record of a love that had bloomed and flourished in the space of 3 months. What she didn't know was that Michael had also been writing letters that he'd been too afraid to give her. In his room, tucked away in an old shoebox, was his own collection of unsent correspondence, filled with all the things he'd wanted to say but never found the courage to express. The weeks following Sarah's departure from Millbrook passed in a haze of adjustment and grief. For both Sarah and Michael, the sudden end of their summer felt like waking from a beautiful dream into a harsh reality that seemed gray and diminished. By comparison, Sarah returned to a household still shadowed by her mother's illness. The woman who had once been the center of their family's emotional life remained fragile and distant, requiring careful handling and constant attention. Sarah's father, never comfortable with emotional situations, had thrown himself into his work with even greater intensity, leaving the daily care of his wife largely to his daughter. The transition back to her old life felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. Sarah's friends from high school seemed younger somehow, their concerns about senior year activities and college applications feeling trivial compared to the depth of what she'd experienced in Millbrook. She found herself unable to relate to their excitement about homecoming dances and football games, their conversations about boys seeming shallow after the profound connection she'd shared with Michael. The 18th night, alone in her childhood bedroom, Sarah would take out the letters she'd written to Michael and read them by lamplight. Each one transported her back to specific moments of their relationship, allowing her to relive conversations and experiences that had taken on an almost mythical quality in her memory. The letters became her most precious possessions, tangible proof that the love she'd experienced had been real. She wrote new letters too, documenting her adjustment to life without Michael and her growing certainty that what they'd shared was irreplaceable. She wrote about the way ordinary moments reminded her of him, about the books she couldn't read because they brought back too many memories, about the future that seemed impossible to imagine without him in it. Meanwhile, Michael had begun his freshman year at Indiana University, throwing himself into his studies with the intensity of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. His roommate, a pre-med student from Indianapolis, found him to be the most serious 18-year-old he'd ever met, someone who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. That Michael's letters to Sarah during this period were filled with descriptions of college life and assurances that he was adjusting well to his new environment. But the letters he wrote and never sent told a different story. In those private communications, he wrote about the loneliness that seemed to follow him everywhere, about the way he'd scan crowds looking for auburn hair and disappointed eyes. He wrote about the other students, who seemed so young and carefree compared to how he felt. He wrote about his classes, which he enjoyed but which felt like a poor substitute for the conversations he'd shared with Sarah. Most painfully, he wrote about the growing fear that their summer love had been just that, a season of happiness that was never meant to last. The phone calls between Sarah and Michael became less frequent as autumn progressed, not from any lack of love, but from the practical difficulties of maintaining a long-distance relationship with limited resources. Both were busy with their respective responsibilities, and the 3-hour drive between their locations made visits complicated and expensive. Their letters, however, continued. Sarah would write long, detailed accounts of her daily life, her mother's gradual improvement, her applications to colleges that would bring her closer to Michael. Michael would respond with descriptions of his courses, his growing confidence as a writer, his plans for the summer when they would be reunited, but there was a quality to their written correspondence that suggested both were trying too hard to maintain something that was slipping away. The easy intimacy of their summer conversations was difficult to recreate on paper, and the practical challenges of their situation began to weigh on both of them. Sarah's applications to colleges near Bloomington were rejected, partly due to her late submission and partly due to her grades from the previous year, which had suffered during her mother's illness. Michael's financial situation made it impossible for him to transfer to a school closer to home, despite his earlier promises to find a way. As winter settled over both their locations, the frequency of their communication began to decline. Sarah, overwhelmed by her family responsibilities and the pressure of her senior year, found it increasingly difficult to maintain the emotional energy required for their relationship. Michael, struggling with his coursework and working part-time to help pay for school, began to feel that he was holding Sarah back from building a life of her own. The letters that Sarah wrote during this period reflect a young woman trying to hold on to something that was slipping away despite her best efforts. She wrote about the guilt she felt for being unable to visit Michael, about the fear that he would meet someone else who could give him the life he deserved. She wrote about the practical realities that seemed to be conspiring against their love, about the growing certainty that sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome the obstacles that life presented. What neither Sarah nor Michael knew was that their letters were crossing in the mail, each writing about their fears and doubts at the same time. Each trying to protect the other from the knowledge that their relationship was slowly dying under the weight of circumstance and distance. The final letter that Sarah wrote to Michael was different from all the others. In it, she tried to explain her growing certainty that they needed to let each other go, that holding on to their summer love was preventing both of them from moving forward with their lives. She wrote about the love that would always exist between them, about the way he'd changed her understanding of herself and what was possible in her life, but she also wrote about the reality of their situation, about the unfairness of asking him to wait for a future that seemed increasingly unlikely to unfold. She wrote about wanting him to be happy, even if that happiness had to exist without her. The letter was written with tears and sealed with a sense of finality that felt like another kind of death. Sarah addressed it carefully, then placed it in the small wooden box with all her other letters to Michael. She told herself she would send it eventually, when she found the courage to let go of the only love she'd ever known, but the letter remained unsent, joining the growing collection of correspondence that documented a love story that seemed destined to remain unfinished. The winter of 1985 brought with it a silence that felt like snow falling on sacred ground. Sarah and Michael's correspondence, which had once been the lifeline connecting their separated hearts, dwindled to occasional postcards and brief notes that carried the weight of things unsaid. Both were drowning in their respective responsibilities, and the effort required to maintain their connection across the miles had become almost unbearable. Sarah's senior year of high school passed in a blur of college applications, part-time work, and the constant management of her mother's fragile emotional state. Mrs. Collins had begun to improve, but her recovery was slow and uncertain, requiring a careful balance of medication, therapy, and family support that fell largely to Sarah. The girl who had once dreamed of following Michael to college found herself anchored to home by chains of love and obligation. Her letters to Michael during this period, still written but rarely sent, reflected the growing distance she felt not just from him but from the person she'd been during their magical summer. She wrote about feeling like she was watching her life from the outside, going through the motions of being a normal teenager while carrying the weight of adult responsibilities that her friends couldn't understand. The unsent letters became a repository for all the emotions she couldn't express anywhere else. She wrote about the guilt she felt for resenting her mother's illness, about the fear that she was disappearing into the role of caregiver and would never find her way back to herself. She wrote about the dreams she'd abandoned and the future that seemed to be slipping away with each passing day. Michael, meanwhile, had thrown himself into his studies with the intensity of someone trying to outrun his own heart. His grades were exceptional, earning him the attention of professors who saw potential in his writing and critical thinking. But his roommate and the few friends he'd made noticed a quality of isolation about him, as if he were present in body but absent in spirit. The letters Michael wrote but never sent during this period revealed a young man struggling with his own form of survivor's guilt. He wrote about the opportunities that were opening up for him, scholarships, internships, the possibility of graduate school, and the growing certainty that accepting these opportunities would mean moving even further away from any possibility of reuniting with Sarah. He wrote about the other students who seemed so carefree, so certain of their places in the world. He wrote about the young women who showed interest in him and his inability to reciprocate their feelings. Most painfully, he wrote about the slow realization that love, no matter how pure and profound, might not be enough to overcome the practical realities of life. The silence between them was not sudden but gradual, like the fading of a photograph left too long in sunlight. Their last exchange of letters occurred in early spring of 1985, brief notes that carried the forced cheerfulness of people trying to convince themselves that everything was fine. Sarah wrote about her acceptance to the local community college, presenting it as a positive choice rather than a compromise. Michael wrote about his summer plans, which would keep him in Bloomington rather than returning to Millbrook. Neither mentioned the growing certainty that their paths were diverging irreversibly. Neither acknowledged the way their phone calls had become stilted and awkward, filled with long pauses and carefully neutral topics. Neither admitted that they were slowly letting go of a love that had once seemed indestructible. The final letter Sarah wrote to Michael was different from all the others. In it, she tried to capture everything she wanted him to know: her gratitude for the way he'd changed her life, her certainty that their love had been real and precious, her understanding that sometimes love meant letting go. She wrote about wanting him to be happy, even if that happiness had to exist without her. But this letter, like so many others, remained unsent. Sarah sealed it in an envelope, addressed it in her careful handwriting, then placed it in the wooden box with all the others. She told herself she would send it someday, when she found the courage to say goodbye properly. But days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, and the letter remained where she placed it. The silence that settled over their relationship was not the absence of love, but the recognition that some stories, no matter how beautiful, are not meant to have happy endings. Both Sarah and Michael carried the summer of 1984 within them like a perfect jewel, untarnished by the compromises and disappointments that had followed. But Sarah's mother's recovery continued slowly but steadily. By the summer of 1985, she was well enough to take on more household responsibilities, freeing Sarah to work full-time at a local office and begin her classes at the community college. The routine of work and school provided a structure that helped her build a new identity, one that incorporated the lessons she'd learned from Michael while acknowledging the reality of her current circumstances. Michael completed his freshman year with honors and was offered a position as a research assistant for one of his professors. The work was intellectually stimulating and provided additional income, but it also meant committing to staying in Bloomington for the summer. He wrote a letter to Sarah explaining his decision, but like her letters to him, it remained unsent. The summer of 1985 passed without contact between them, the first since they'd met. For both, it was a season of acceptance and adjustment, of learning to carry their love as a memory rather than a living thing. They had become, without ever formally deciding to do so, a part of each other's past rather than each other's present. But Sarah's box of letters continued to grow, though less frequently now. She wrote about the person she was becoming, about the way their love had given her a standard by which to measure all future relationships. She wrote about the certainty that she had been changed by loving Michael, changed in ways that would influence every choice she made for the rest of her life. The years that followed passed like chapters in a book that Sarah and Michael were writing separately, their stories diverging into different genres entirely. Sarah's narrative became one of quiet resilience and gradual healing, while Michael's evolved into a tale of academic achievement and creative development. Neither forgot the summer of 1984, but both learned to carry it as a cherished memory rather than an active wound. Sarah completed her associate degree with honors, then transferred to the State University to pursue a bachelor's degree in English literature. Her professors noticed her unusual maturity and the depth of her literary analysis, particularly when it came to poetry and works dealing with themes of love and loss. She had a way of understanding the emotional undercurrents of literature that suggested personal experience beyond her years. During her junior year, Sarah met David Richardson, a graduate student in education who was working as a teaching assistant in one of her classes. David was kind, stable, and thoroughly decent, the sort of man who would make a good husband and father. He was also nothing like Michael, which Sarah told herself was exactly what she needed. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared interests in literature and teaching, mutual respect, and a comfortable companionship that felt safe after the intensity of her relationship with Michael. David was patient with Sarah's occasional distances, understanding that she carried some hurt from her past without pressing for details she wasn't ready to share. Sarah's letters to Michael during this period, still written but never sent, reflected her internal struggle with the idea of loving someone new. She wrote about feeling guilty for caring about David, as if she were betraying the memory of their summer together. She wrote about the different quality of her feelings for David, warmer and more stable than the passionate intensity she'd shared with Michael, but somehow less transformative. Michael, meanwhile, had graduated with highest honors and been accepted to graduate school for creative writing. His professors recognized his talent and encouraged him to pursue his MFA with an eye toward eventually getting a PhD and teaching at the university level. His writing had matured significantly, dealing with themes of loss, memory, and the way the past shapes the present. His poetry and short stories often featured characters who were haunted by perfect moments from their past, unable to fully engage with their present because of their attachment to what they'd lost. His professors praised his emotional depth and literary sophistication, though some suggested that his work might benefit from a broader range of experiences. Michael had dated occasionally during his undergraduate years, but never seriously. He found himself comparing every woman he met to Sarah, invariably finding them lacking in some indefinable quality that he couldn't name but couldn't forget. His friends teased him about his impossibly high standards, not knowing that those standards were based on a real person who had set the bar for what love could be. The letters Michael wrote, but never sent during this period, revealed a young man struggling with the decision to fully commit to his academic and creative future. He wrote about the fellowships he'd been offered, the opportunities to study abroad, the possibility of a life dedicated to literature and writing. But he also wrote about the fear that pursuing these dreams would mean definitively closing the door on any possibility of reuniting with Sarah. Sarah's mother's recovery had been more complete than anyone had dared hope. By 1987, she was able to return to part-time work and had even begun volunteering at the local library, helping with their literacy program. The family dynamics had shifted significantly during her illness and recovery, with Sarah taking on a more adult role that she maintained even as her mother regained her strength. It was during her senior year of college that Sarah accepted David's proposal of marriage. The decision was made with her head rather than her heart, a practical choice that promised security and companionship. David was a good man who loved her deeply, and Sarah believed that the comfortable affection she felt for him was what mature Love was supposed to feel like her letter to Michael about the engagement was one of the longest she'd ever written. In it, she tried to explain her decision without betraying David or diminishing what she and Michael had shared. She wrote about the different seasons of life requiring different kinds of love, about the necessity of building a future on practical foundations rather than passionate dreams, but like all her letters to Michael, this one remained unsent. Sarah sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to his last known address, then placed it in the wooden box that had become a repository for all her unexpressed feelings. The box now contained dozens of letters, a complete record of her emotional life over the years since their separation. Michael learned of Sarah's engagement through a brief mention in the Millbrook newspaper, which his mother still sent him occasionally. The announcement was small, just a few lines mentioning that Sarah Collins, daughter of Robert and Margaret Collins, would be marrying David Richardson in the spring. The words hit him like a physical blow, confirming what he'd always known but never wanted to accept, that their story was truly over. The letter he wrote in response was raw and painful, filled with all the regret and longing he'd been carrying for years. He wrote about the dreams he'd harbored of somehow finding his way back to her, about the way he'd measured every subsequent relationship against the standard of their summer together. He wrote about the love that had never dimmed, despite the silence that had grown between them, but this letter, like all the others, remained unsent. Michael sealed it in an envelope, then placed it in the shoebox where he kept all his correspondence to Sarah. He told himself that she deserved to be happy, that David was probably a better choice for her than he could ever be. But the knowledge that she was truly beyond his reach felt like a kind of death. Sarah's wedding in the spring of 1988 was a small, elegant affair held in the garden of her family's church. She wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame, and carried a bouquet of white roses that reminded her, painfully, of the flowers she'd arranged in Helen's shop during the summer she'd first fallen in love. As she walked down the aisle toward David, Sarah caught sight of a man in the back of the church who, for a moment, looked like Michael. Her heart stopped, then resumed beating with a rhythm that felt like fear mixed with hope. But when she looked again, the man was gone. If he'd ever been there at all. The reception was held at the local country club, with dancing and dinner and all the traditional celebrations of a new marriage. Sarah smiled and laughed and accepted congratulations with the grace of someone who had learned to perform happiness even when she wasn't sure she felt it. David was attentive and loving, clearly thrilled to be her husband, and Sarah told herself that this was enough, that contentment was a worthy goal for a life. That night, alone in her new apartment, while David attended to some last-minute details at the school where he'd been hired as a principal, Sarah wrote her final letter to Michael. In it, she tried to explain the choice she'd made, not just to marry David but to build a life that didn't include the possibility of their reunion. She wrote about the love she would always carry for him, about the way their summer had shaped her understanding of what was possible between two people. But she also wrote about the necessity of moving forward, of building a future on the foundation of what was real and present rather than what might have been. The letter was sealed and placed in the wooden box with all the others, a complete record of a love story that had existed primarily in the realm of unexpressed emotion. Sarah carried the box with her to her new home, where it would remain hidden in the back of her closet, a secret archive of the girl she'd been and the love she'd never forgotten. 15 years had passed since the summer of 1984, and Sarah Richardson née Collins had built a life that looked exactly like what she'd planned. She and David had settled in a comfortable suburban home, where she taught high school English and he served as principal of the local middle school. Their marriage was stable and affectionate, built on shared values and mutual respect, though it lacked the transformative passion that Sarah had once known. They had 2 children, Emma, now 12, and James, 10. Sarah had thrown herself into motherhood with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything else, finding in her children a source of joy and purpose that filled many of the spaces in her heart that had remained empty since Michael. She was known in their community as a devoted mother and gifted teacher, someone who brought unusual depth and understanding to her work with young people. The wooden box containing her letters to Michael had moved with her through 3 different homes, always carefully packed and placed in the back of her closet, always present but never opened. There were moments, usually late at night when she couldn't sleep, when Sarah would remember the box and feel a stirring of the emotions it contained. But she had learned to redirect those feelings into her writing, her teaching, and her family. Sarah Had begun writing poetry again in her 30s, finding in verse a way to express the deeper currents of her emotional life without betraying the commitments she'd made. Her poems dealt with themes of memory, loss, and the way the past lived on in the present. She'd even published a few pieces in literary magazines, though she wrote under her maiden name and never shared this achievement with David or her children. Michael, meanwhile, had built a successful career as a writer and professor. After completing his MFA, he'd stayed on at Indiana University to pursue his PhD, eventually joining the faculty as a professor of creative writing. His poetry had been published in prestigious journals, and his first collection, titled Summer Letters, had won a regional poetry prize. His writing was praised for its emotional honesty and sophisticated understanding of love and loss. Critics noted his ability to capture the way memory can both preserve and distort experience, the way the past can haunt the present without necessarily destroying it. What they didn't know was that much of his work was inspired by a single summer and a love that had never been fully expressed. Michael had never married, though he'd had several serious relationships over the years. His friends and colleagues often wondered why someone so intelligent and successful remained single, but Michael had never found anyone who made him feel the way Sarah had. He'd learned to be content with his work, his writing, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived on his own terms. The discovery that would change everything came in the spring of 1999, when Sarah's family decided to move to a larger house to accommodate David's elderly mother, who could no longer live alone. The process of packing 15 years of accumulated possessions was exhausting, but it also provided an opportunity to sort through items that had been forgotten in closets and storage areas. It was Emma who found the wooden box, hidden behind Sarah's winter coats in the master bedroom closet. The box was beautiful, hand-carved with an intricate pattern of roses and vines, and Emma was immediately curious about its contents. When she brought it to her mother, Sarah felt her heart stop. Sarah's explanation was carefully vague, old letters and mementos from her college years, nothing important. But Emma, with the persistence of a 12-year-old, pressed for more details. The box was so beautiful, and it seemed to contain something that mattered to her mother in a way that Emma couldn't understand. That evening, after the children were asleep and David was grading papers in his study, Sarah sat alone in their bedroom with the wooden box in her hands. She hadn't opened it in years, but she could feel the weight of all those unsent letters, all those unexpressed emotions that had shaped her life in ways she'd never fully acknowledged. The first letter she pulled out was dated July 15, 1984. Written during the early days of her relationship with Michael. Reading it was like stepping back in time, like becoming again the 18-year-old girl who had fallen in love with such intensity that it had changed the very structure of her heart. The letter was full of wonder and uncertainty, documenting the beginning of a love that had felt like discovering a new country. Sarah spent the next several hours reading through the letters, reliving her relationship with Michael through the words she'd written but never sent. The letters told the complete story of their love, the joy of discovery, the pain of separation, the slow process of letting go. They also revealed the woman she'd been, passionate and articulate and willing to risk everything for love. The final letter, written on her wedding night, was perhaps the most painful to read. In it, Sarah had tried to explain her marriage to David as a practical choice, a way of building a stable life even if it meant sacrificing the possibility of perfect love. But reading it now, Sarah realized that she'd been trying to convince herself as much as Michael. The discovery of the letters forced Sarah to confront questions she'd been avoiding for 15 years. Had she made the right choice in marrying David? Had she been fair to him, building a marriage on affection rather than passion? Had she been fair to herself, settling for contentment when she'd once known transcendence? The letters also made her wonder about Michael, about the life he'd built and whether he'd ever found the kind of love they'd shared. She realized that she'd been carrying him with her all these years, that in some deep part of herself she'd never really let go of what they'd had together. As she sat surrounded by the physical evidence of her unexpressed love, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She would find Michael and give him the letters. Not because she expected anything to come of it, but because he deserved to know how deeply he'd been loved, how completely he'd changed her life. The decision felt both terrifying and inevitable, like finally acknowledging a truth that had been waiting patiently for recognition. Sarah carefully returned the letters to their box, then sat holding it like a treasure that she'd finally found the courage to claim. The search for Michael took Sarah 2 weeks of careful investigation. She began with the internet, discovering that he'd become a respected poet and professor at Indiana University. His faculty biography mentioned his MFA and PhD, his publications, and awards, but said nothing about his personal life. His author photo showed a man who was recognizably the boy she'd loved, though his face had acquired the thoughtful lines that come with years of studying the human condition. Sarah read his published poetry with the intensity of someone decoding a secret message. His work was beautiful and complex, dealing with themes of memory and loss that she recognized from their conversations 15 years earlier. Several poems seemed to reference their relationship, though obliquely, speaking of summers that lasted forever and letters that were never sent. Finding his current address required more detective work, but Sarah's determination was stronger than her inhibitions. She discovered that Michael lived in a small house near the university, according to public records. The address felt like a sacred text, something that required careful handling and respectful approach. The decision to actually contact Michael was more difficult than finding him had been. Sarah spent several days crafting a letter that would explain her intention without presuming anything about his current life or feelings. She wrote about the discovery of the letters, about the realization that he deserved to know how deeply he'd been loved, about the need to complete a conversation that had been interrupted 15 years earlier. The letter was simple and direct, asking if he would be willing to meet with her to receive the letters she'd written but never sent. She included her phone number and email address, then mailed the letter before she could change her mind. Michael's response came within a week, a brief email that managed to convey both surprise and careful interest. He wrote that he'd often wondered what had become of her, that he'd be honored to receive the letters she'd written. He suggested they meet at a coffee shop near the university, a neutral location that would allow them to reconnect without the pressure of a more intimate setting. The drive to Bloomington felt like a journey through time. Sarah had taken a personal day from school, telling David only that she had some old business to settle. The lie felt necessary but uncomfortable, the first serious deception of their marriage. She carried the wooden box on the passenger seat, touching it occasionally as if to confirm that it was real. Michael was waiting at the coffee shop when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with a view of the door. He looked older, of course, but the essential Michael was still there, the intelligent eyes, the careful way he held himself, the sense of depth that had attracted her all those years ago. When he saw her, his expression shifted through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been wonder. Their initial conversation was carefully polite, filled with the kind of catching up that people do when they're testing the waters of reconnection. Sarah learned that Michael had never married, that he'd dedicated his life to writing and teaching, that he'd achieved the kind of success he'd dreamed of as a young man. Michael learned that Sarah had built the stable life she'd always wanted, that she was a mother and teacher, that she'd found contentment if not perfect happiness. When Sarah finally presented the wooden box, Michael received it with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact. He opened it carefully, revealing the dozens of letters that Sarah had written over the years, each one sealed in its envelope and addressed in her careful handwriting. The moment when Michael realized what he was holding was almost too intimate to witness. Sarah could see the recognition in his eyes, the understanding that these letters represented not just words on paper but the complete emotional history of their relationship. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the first letter, and Sarah had to look away from the naked vulnerability in his expression. Michael asked if he could read the letters privately, and Sarah understood that this was a gift that required solitary appreciation. They agreed to meet again the following day, after he'd had time to process what she'd given him that night. In his small house filled with books and memories, Michael read Sarah's letters in chronological order. Each one transported him back to specific moments of their relationship, but more than that, they revealed the depth of love that had existed between them, love that had been expressed in private even when it couldn't be shared. The letters showed him a Sarah he'd never fully known, passionate, articulate, struggling with the same fears and hopes that had dominated his own thoughts. They revealed that their love had been mutual and complete, that she'd understood him as deeply as he'd understood her, that the connection they'd shared had been real and transformative for both of them. When they met the next day, Michael had his own revelation to share. He led Sarah to his house, where he showed her the shoebox containing all the letters he'd written to her over the years, letters that had documented his own journey through love and loss and the slow process of learning to live with unfulfilled Longing, the exchange of their unsent correspondence was perhaps the most profound moment of honesty either had ever experienced. For the first time in 15 years, they could see the complete picture of their relationship, not just what they'd shared in person, but what they'd carried in their hearts throughout the years of separation. Reading Michael's letters, Sarah discovered that their love had been even more mutual than she'd known. His words revealed that he'd never stopped loving her, that he'd measured every subsequent relationship against the standard of their summer together, that he'd built his life around the memory of what they'd shared, the recognition that they'd both been carrying the same love, the same regret, the same sense of incompleteness, was overwhelming. They sat in Michael's living room, surrounded by the evidence of their unexpressed devotion, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd discovered, but the moment of recognition was also a moment of reckoning. Sarah was married, a mother, committed to a life that didn't include the possibility of being with Michael. The letters had revealed the depth of their love, but they couldn't change the choices that had been made, the lives that had been built, the responsibilities that had been accepted. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of Sarah's life. She and Michael talked about the love that had never died, about the different paths their lives had taken, about the impossibility of returning to what they'd once shared. They talked about the meaning of the letters, about the way love can exist in memory and honor without requiring action. In the end, they agreed that sharing the letters had been enough. They'd both needed to know that their love had been real and mutual, that they'd been right to carry it with them through the years. But they also agreed that some loves are meant to exist in the realm of memory, that the attempt to recreate perfect moments often destroys their perfection. Sarah drove home that evening carrying both wooden box and shoebox, the complete record of a love story that had finally found its proper ending. She would return to her marriage with a deeper understanding of her own heart, and Michael would continue his life with the knowledge that he'd been loved as completely as he'd loved. The letters had served their purpose, not by reuniting two lovers, but by providing closure to a story that had remained unfinished for 15 years. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most profound love is the love that knows when to let go, when to honor what was without demanding what could never be. In the years that followed, Sarah and Michael maintained no contact, but both carried the memory of their reunion as a kind of benediction. Sarah's marriage to David deepened, founded now on complete honesty about the nature of love and the different forms it can take. Michael's writing evolved to include themes of completion and acceptance, his understanding of love enriched by the knowledge that it can exist perfectly in memory without requiring physical presence. The letters themselves were eventually donated to a university archive, where they serve as a testament to the enduring power of unexpressed love and the courage required to finally speak what has long been held in silence.